Morning, everyone. Welcome to Sunday School. This morning we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 37. In case you didn't know, Genesis 37 is where we see the transition between Jacob, kind of switch over to Joseph. The focus becomes Joseph from this point moving on. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning. The theme of this chapter and really the rest of the book of the Genesis, and really was the whole theme of Genesis till now, is that God is sovereign over all things, even things that we may not consider his sovereignty over, such as bad choices and sins by other people. So if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and stop the video and read all of Genesis 37, and then we will continue on. It's impossible to live in a world where we're not hurt by someone else's sin, right? Most of us have been the victim of other people's bad behaviors. Some people have been the victim of our bad behaviors. But we know that once you've been wounded by someone else's sin, it's very easy to think, where is God in all of this? If God is all powerful, all loving, then why is he allowing these terrible things to happen to me? If God is in control, why do wicked men literally seem like they get away with murder? If God is sovereign, as we'll see Joseph able to say, right? If God is sovereign, why am I in the pits? And that's the question that Joseph can literally ask in this chapter. Due to his brother's sin, he was literally in a pit. From the things, and from there, things didn't get better. His brothers didn't kill him like they had originally planned, but they did sell their 17-year-old brother into slavery, into a foreign land. And as that caravan made its way past south, back past probably a lot of Jacob's land and things like that, you can imagine Joseph looking out and just wondering, how did I get to this point? The grief and the loneliness probably overwhelmed him as he wondered if he'd ever see his father again. He must have wrestled with fear and anger and feelings of rejection as he thought of his brother's cruelty towards him. And he wondered, literally, if God is sovereign, why am I in the pits? It's interesting, God is not mentioned in Genesis 37 at all. And a skeptic might say, see, God is not there when you need him. If he cared about you, would never let sinful men's actions destroy your life or anything like that. But even though God is not mentioned here, God's sovereign providence runs throughout this chapter like you would never believe if you really just thought about it. It's a strong river of God's sovereignty flowing here. And you get to see that the sins and everything that happened here is a part of God's overall purpose. And if you remember, God's sovereign, we know God's sovereign hand is behind this because back in Abraham's life, back in Genesis 15, here's what God said to Abraham. Now listen to this. This is prophetic, and this should cause you to understand that God is in control of these things. God says to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, which is what we're going to see very soon, right? Where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. We know that happens. But I will also judge the nation with whom they serve. We know that happens to Egypt. And afterward, they will come out, his people will come out with many possessions. We know that happens too. And then in the fourth generation, they shall return back to the promised land. And Amorite is not, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete, he says. So we see God had planned this whole thing years before it even happened. And in Genesis 38, you'll see that it's revealed that God wanted to get his people to Egypt, to get them out of the corrupt land of Canaan, for them to become corrupt. They were being corrupted. That was the reality of what was going on. And so to preserve the nation from integration with the Canaanites, which was happening under Jacob's watch, he puts them in Jacob. He puts the Israelite nation in Egypt, and they become slaves there for 400 years. And this is God solidifying his people for then when they come back and take over the promised land, and God's judgment is unloaded on all these evil nations. But the point is clear here. God is sovereignly orchestrating all these events according to his eternal plan. But, you ask, does that make God responsible for sin? Because if he's using people's sin, then it will work it out, right? So the biblical answer here is clearly no. Men are not responsible, or God is not responsible for man's sin, but God does use their sin to accomplish his sovereign purpose. And so we know that is true. And there are many verses in the Bible that shows God is sovereign over men's sin and yet not responsible for it. And if that boggles your mind, how God can grant freedom of choice, but also be sovereign over sin, the sin that accomplishes the exact thing that man is trying to stop from happening, and then we can join with Paul, right? When he says, oh, the depths and the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. It takes humility to even submit to, in any way, shape, or form, God's sovereignty. On the bottom line of this marvelous story in Genesis 37 is that since God is sovereign over all, we can trust him when things seem to go against us. And that's so helpful at a time like this, right? During this pandemic and all the things that are going on around us. There are three main characters in this drama, each of whom demonstrates the sovereignty of God despite their sin or imperfection, and that's what we're gonna look at today. You have Jacob and his insensitive favoritism and his foolishness. You have Joseph being very naive, and then there's Joseph's brothers who are hardened by their sin. But the real character here, the real focus of this chapter and the rest of Genesis, the providential work of God, and how God works behind the scenes to orchestrate exactly what he has purposed to happen to the nation of Israel. And so some lessons we're going to draw here. There's three of them. First, God is sovereign even when parents are insensitive and foolish. I don't know about you, but I'm insensitive and foolish often as a parent, and it worries me that will affect my children. And so I'm very sensitive to what is going on here. As we've already seen, Jacob wasn't the world's greatest father. He made a lot of mistakes with his family. He allowed his wives to engage in over a war who would have the most children, which created a climate of rivalry in the family. Of course, he played favoritism with Rebekah and Joseph. He seemingly would have let Dinah, his only daughter, marry the pagan that raped her. He didn't deal with the treachery and the brutality of what his sons did as a result of Dinah's rape. And he was also blind, as we see here, to his other son's hatred towards Joseph, who he openly favored. If he wasn't blind to that, then why would he put him in situations that made them hate him more and could put him in danger, right? But before we point the finger at Jacob, let's remember that this is a situation that can develop in a lot of our lives, right? To put this in modern terms, right? We see this happen a lot of times. We are, as parents, at different stages in our life, and sometimes we can treat one kid differently than maybe 5 years from now when we have maybe more money or more maturity than we treat another kid, and that can cause bitterness. We can play favoritism sometimes when we don't even know it, in the way that we have learned so much with one kid that we're not quite as hard and been sanctified, so we're not quite as hard as much on another kid. And so we can see that this is something that every parent probably struggles with at one point or another, right? And that's what's happening here. Joseph's older brothers are a bunch of rowdy guys who slaughtered a whole village, and they see Joseph as the favored one, and they don't fear God at all. And so they decide that because the favoritism of Joseph, that they just don't like him very much. And and so they hated that special coat that was made. It was probably a full-length coat. It was probably like Dad's favorite was maybe stitched on the back. No, not really, but it showed favoritism. And it indicated that maybe Joseph was the heir. Reuben had ruined that by his actions with the concubine in the last chapter. And so this whole thing is Jacob favoring his favorite son, and others being affected by that. And so in the line of duties, Joseph brings back a bad report to his dad, and the brothers couldn't even be peaceful towards Joseph at all, right? They had this hatred inside of them for him. But again, before we condemn Jacob for his bad fathering here, bad parenting, let's admit it's easy sometimes for us to slip into this too, especially dads who may work a lot and come home and they're tired and don't spend time with their kids. It's easy to fall out of touch with your kids, right? And so, Jacob had lost touch, I think, with his older kids here, and he had treated Joseph a lot better, and it just leads to a lot of rivalry in the family. And so the point is this: while Jacob was not right, why we need to work at avoiding some mistakes, the same mistakes in our lives, God is still sovereign even when parents are insensitive and foolish. Jacob should have been wise enough to not show favoritism, but he wasn't. Maybe your parents did or now are doing the same things towards you, and you're bitter at them for the wrongs that they've done. So you have two choices. You can blame them for not protecting you. You can blame them for all the things that have happened in your life. Or you can give your life to the Lord and let him sovereignly use those things to work for your good and to work according to his will. So no matter what your family background or your circumstances are, you're responsible for obeying the Lord. Joseph's life shows that it's possible to obey the Lord even when you're mistreated by others. And maybe because you've been mistreated by your family, your parents. Even if you come from a rotten background, God still wants you to confess your sin, forsake your sin, and obey him regardless of the circumstances of the past. And so the first lesson that we see here is God is sovereign even when parents are insensitive and foolish. The next point we see here is God is sovereign even when teenagers are naive. Joseph had those two dreams. It was obvious that what the point of those dreams was, that he would eventually be elevated over his family. Some think he was wrong for doing this. I would say that he was naive. He was a 17-year-old who lacked the wisdom and maturity that came with a few more years of life. To have to share these dreams in confidence with his father would have been a lot better than sharing it with everybody. Many times, a person like Joseph, who's very competent, he's threatening to other people and doesn't even know it. It doesn't seem that Joseph shared these dreams to get a reaction out of his brothers. He seems innocent of any wrong motives, but this was just naive. It was not something that he should have done. When he goes out to meet his brothers, he should have kept that coat at home, right? And I don't know any adult that can look back and say, I didn't do anything dumb when I was young. And we've all been stupid. We've all been immature in our younger days. Hopefully, if we have wise parents, we listen to them and other Christians. We don't make the same youthful mistakes, but we all do a certain amount of stupid, naive things in our youth, in spite of wise counsel a lot of times. But regardless, God is sovereign, even when teenagers are naive. And I assume that God gave Joseph these dreams since they're prophetically true, right? Why didn't God wait till later to give him these dreams? I don't know. But we do know that Joseph's naivete toward everybody did not thwart the sovereign plan of God. While we should seek to be wise, when we don't, we can trust that God will overrule and use even the dumb things that we do in our lives to help us submit to him, right? And so the second lesson is that God is sovereign over even naive teenagers. The third lesson that we see here is that God is sovereign even when people are hardened by sin. And this is where we focus on Jacob's brothers. When Jacob foolishly sends Joseph to check up on his brothers, he's in this... He creates this really explosive situation. First, you see the favorite one of his father, a kid who shows up with worldly brothers, to these worldly brothers with his good behavior. And dad unwisely puts Junior over the whole older brothers and gives him a coat. And that makes it obvious that there's favoritism going on. The kid brother has the gall of reporting these two dreams to his brothers and that they're eventually going to bow down to him. You can see how this would set off an explosion in these brothers, especially when we know they had a bad temper because what they did to Dinah, or the people who raped Dinah. So when we see Joseph coming at a distance, when they see him coming at a distance, they see that cursed coat. They plot together to kill him, throw him into the pit, and they'll say that a wild beast devoured him. At this point, Reuben, the oldest, intervenes, persuades his brothers not to shed blood, but to just throw Joseph into the pit. And what he planned on doing was come back later and rescuing them. He wants to get back on dad's good side after sleeping with his concubine. And once Joseph was in the pit, Reuben goes off, perhaps to check something, whatever. And while the brothers are there by themselves without Reuben, along comes the caravan. The Midianites, Ishmaelites, same people. See that in Judges chapter 8. At this point, Judah gets this brainstorm. He says, "There's no profit. If we just let Joseph die in the pit." And he said, "Let's do this. Let's sell him to the traders instead of killing him, and we'll make a couple shekels on top of it, right?" And it strikes everyone as a good idea. Isn't it amazing how we can appease our consciences by rationalizing our sin in comparison to other sin? I think we all do that at times. Compared to murdering your brother, sell him into slavery doesn't sound too bad, right? You can hear them saying, it would be better for Joseph, better off this way if we just sold him into slavery. And 20 years later, you can see that Joseph's pleading was a terrible thing, or was not a terrible thing, or he was pleading with them, but they rationalized their sin, saying, after all, he's our brother. Comparative morality is no morality at all, by the way. Meanwhile, Reuben comes back to the pit, finds it empty, and panics. At this point, we can discern that his true motive wasn't really saving Joseph. It was looking good in his father's eyes, because when he hears the plan, what happened, he didn't run after and rescue Joseph. He just let it be. And so we know that that's what his motive was. And then you can see when they go back and they console their dad, how evil their hearts really are, because they make it seem like they're grieving with him, probably patting him on the back, saying, Romans 8:28, Dad, all things, right? But we can see that God was sovereign over all of this. And Joseph didn't find his brothers. Like if you think about the steps of God's sovereignty here that show that God was in every detail of this, right? When Joseph goes to find his brothers, he doesn't find them. He can't find them. So he meets this man, and this man tells him where the brothers are. If he never met that man, he would have never found his brothers. He would have never been thrown in the pit, right? So you can see how God providentially works all these things out in what's going on here. So this is God working out, right? Joseph was loved by his father, and his father was naive. His brothers were evil. All of that is a part of God's sovereignty to work out Joseph's capture, his jailing, all of that, so that he can eventually get to Egypt and save the nation of Israel from the famine that's coming, so that later on they can go back to the promised land and do God's work. But perhaps the most convincing evidence of God's sovereignty in these events, and as we look at the whole Bible, is the parallels between Joseph and Jesus, right? Just as Joseph had loved his father and sent him to seek the welfare of his brethren, so Jesus was loved and sent by the Father for our welfare. Just as Joseph's brothers hated him because he spoke the truth about their sin, and he convicted them of their sin by his righteous life, the same was true about Jesus. Just as Joseph's brothers sold him for a few pieces of silver, so Jesus was betrayed the same way. Joseph's brothers sought to get rid of him so that he would not reign over them. By their action, it resulted in him eventually reigning over them, right? The rejection of him resulted in his later becoming the savior from the famine. So even though the Jewish leaders didn't want Jesus to reign over them, by killing him, it resulted in him becoming the savior. Exalted in his resurrection as Lord at the right hand of the Father, just as Joseph was with Pharaoh. Joseph could have easily thought, if only I'd never met that guy in a field, none of this stuff would have ever happened. But his wandering in the field and meeting that man weren't bad luck. Even though God isn't mentioned in this chapter, he was obviously at work. Often when God is most silent, he is most present, brothers and sisters. Years later, Joseph would find his brothers, and they would meet in Egypt, and he would say to them, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about the present result, which was to save everybody. It's a beautiful picture of God's sovereignty. The story of Joseph is all about God's sovereignty, that God is in absolute control of all things. We may see the reason for God's dealings a few years after when we finally deal with things. But we may not ever see how God's sovereignty is working for us until we see it in light of eternity. But like Joseph, we need to trust God even when we don't understand. Joseph never wavers on his faith in the Lord in any way, shape, or form over these next 12, 13 chapters. So the bottom line is we can trust God no matter what happens to us, because his sovereign loving hand is on us, even in the little happenstances of lives. When we're in the pits, brothers and sisters, we need to remember that God is sovereign over all the details of our lives. We can trust him, that he's working all things together for our good. Have a great night.